In this episode, I'm going to go over oxalates and their role in autism, how to test for them, and what to do about them if they're elevated in your child. Now, quick little primer in case you've never heard of oxalates. They're basically oxalate or oxalic acid. It's a highly acidic organic acid, and it's actually the most acidic organic acid in the human body. And what it can do is it can bind with minerals and even heavy metals to form crystals called oxalate crystals. So oxalate can bind, or oxalic acid can bind with calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, mercury, and so on. And this process causes, for whatever reason, the chemical bonds between the oxalic acid and the mineral or the heavy metal, it causes these crystals to be very difficult to dissociate. Those compounds become difficult to dissociate, and the crystals that are formed have these jagged edges, as can be seen under a microscope, and then they can deposit in all sorts of places in the body, including the bones, joints, kidneys, blood vessels, lungs, the thyroid, even the brain, and even in the eyes, right? So because of their jagged edges, due to the nature of the compound that's created, it can cause a lot of discomfort when it's lodged in our tissues. And we have some research that has shown that oxalates are very often elevated in autistic children. So this is definitely something that should be on your radar. Now, there's several, obviously the pain and discomfort that can cause is one thing, but other things an increased oxalate burden can cause in the body include, it can deplete the antioxidant glutathione, it can increase oxidative stress, it can actually inhibit the absorption of essential minerals such as calcium, magnesium, zinc, and iron. And as I already mentioned, the oxalate or the oxalic acid can bind with heavy metals and trap them in the body. Now, obviously, these are not beneficial things. You definitely want to avoid these things in your child's body if you can help it. So the first thing you want to do is test, does your child have elevated oxalates? Now, the thing about oxalates, right, is they can be formed during the normal course of our metabolism. They can be formed, but the biggest sources of oxalates are actually from the diet. Certain fruits and vegetables and grains are very high in oxalates, and I'll go over a few of the most common culprits when it comes to an increased oxalate burden in the diet. And then the other thing that can cause increases in oxalates is yeast and fungal overgrowths and infections. So we know that, for example, the mold Aspergillus can create oxalate crystals, and Candida overgrowth has been associated with increased oxalates. So, as I've covered in previous episodes, autistic children tend to have high yeast overgrowth or Candida overgrowth. So we know that it's a common occurrence. Therefore, oxalates are actually a high risk item, and they're definitely one of the things you'd want to test for as part of the preliminary tests that you run on your child. Now, thankfully, luckily, the organic acids test from the Great Plains lab actually has a few markers for oxalates. There's two markers that they basically indicate more of a genetic kind of disorder with oxalate metabolism. And then there's one marker called oxalic that can actually signal an increase in oxalates. And they're usually from either diet or yeast or fungal overgrowth. And more often than not, it's a mixture of the two. So what you likely see if you run the organic acids test and your child's yeast markers are high or elevated, it's very likely that the oxalic acid marker will be elevated too. So that's one way to test for it. And generally, there is some research I cite in my book that independently from the Great Plains lab has found elevated oxalates to be an issue in autistic children. But because the Great Plains lab runs so many tests on autistic children, they've told us I've heard from the director of the lab, Dr. Shaw, when I've been to conferences, workshops, summits that he has spoken at, and he would tell us that I can't remember the percentage, but it was a huge percentage of autistic children have an elevated oxalate burden. So this is definitely one of the most common metabolic challenges or health challenges that your child could suffer from. So it's definitely something, like I said already, to be tested for, to be on your radar, for you to be aware of, because it's not particularly difficult to address an elevated oxalate burden in the diet. I'll go over that in a couple of minutes. And it's not particularly difficult to address an yeast infection, for example, right? This is why it's so important to test for it and address it as soon as you can, right? Now, so if let's say you run the organic acids test and the oxalates are indeed elevated, which is more often than not, they will be at least slightly elevated or at least slightly above the range. So in this instance, what is most likely the best protocol to do is an antifungal protocol, which can be either medications or herbals. Generally, if it's not a particularly heavy infection or overgrowth, you can just go with the herbal antifungal supplements and probiotics. And then you would also do the low oxalate diet. So that's generally the basic standard protocol to address elevated oxalates. Now, the low oxalate diet, basically, you need to first of all learn what foods are high in oxalates, and then gradually reduce them by about 5 to 10% per week from your child's diet. This is extremely important. You want to only reduce the oxalate containing foods by about 5 to 10% per week, because if you suddenly decrease the oxalates in your child's diet, what can very often happen, if there's been a burden of a body burden of oxalates, is the body will dump oxalates too quickly, and because of their physical nature of having these crystal-like shapes and structures and jagged edges, this can be an extremely uncomfortable process. This is why you want to let the body slowly get rid of the excess oxalate burden. So you would basically find out what the high oxalate containing foods are, figure out which of them your child eats and in what quantity, and then think about little strategies how to reduce those foods gradually. So I'll get into the foods in a second, just to give you an idea what high oxalate foods are. So basically, some of the foods with the highest oxalate content include almonds, amaranth, beets, buckwheat, carrots, chard, chia seeds, chocolate, cocoa, various nuts, parsnips, potatoes, sweet potatoes, rhubarb, sesame seeds, soy is particularly high, spinach is very high in oxalates, spelt, and wheat. So these are, as you can see, a lot of staple foods. Especially, many people think spinach is such a healthy food, but if oxalates are a problem for you or your child, spinach is not going to at all be healthy, especially if it's not non-organic and contains pesticides or various other chemicals. It's actually not a healthy food if high oxalates are a problem for the person eating it, right? So basically, grains and seeds and nuts and a lot of root vegetables like parsnips, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beets, these are the high oxalate containing foods. So yeah, so you basically, you get a list of these foods, you figure out which of them your child eats the most, and then you would just slowly reduce. For example, in this case, let's say your child eats chocolate, cocoa, some nuts, some sweet potatoes, let's say some spinach, some wheat, or whatever, bread or other whole grain foods, carrots. You would start with, let's say, week 1, you would remove the spinach and maybe start reducing the wheat containing products. Then the second week, you might, let's say, reduce the sweet potatoes, and so on. And you would want to substitute for lower oxalate containing foods, or foods that don't generally have oxalates. So it's similar to the gluten-free diet, where you reduce the foods like the casein and the gluten containing foods gradually, or you can swap in some gluten-free products, casein-free products as well. So it's every family situation is different. Sometimes you're very busy, sometimes you don't have the energy or the willpower to do it. Sometimes you have more time on your hands. Let's say one of the parents isn't working. So every family needs to navigate this in the way that is right for them. But that's the basic low oxalate diet. Now, in conjunction with the low oxalate diet, there's some supplements that are very, very helpful when you want to address elevated oxalates in your child. So I already mentioned that the antifungal protocol, which will be generally herbal antifungal supplements, probiotics, and what you would also need to ideally do is reduce the sugar in the diet, because that will feed the yeast, and in turn that can kind of contribute to them producing oxalates and so on. So in other supplements that can be helpful here would be, for example, vitamin B6. This is used in one enzyme that degrades oxalates, right? So that's helpful. Another very useful one is calcium and magnesium citrate at meal times. So you basically give it to your child. Let's say if you have it in powder form in a drink or a chewable, you give them to your child during the meal times, and it has to be exactly citrate, so calcium citrate, magnesium citrate, not other forms of these minerals. And the reason you give that form of these supplements to your child during the meal is because they actually will bind with oxalates in the gut, and they will form these indigestible oxalate crystals. So your child will just excrete them through the poop, so they won't get absorbed into the body. So this is one way to reduce even if this is basically when there's oxalates in the diet, in the food, you're reducing the burden of oxalates that will get absorbed into your child's body. So these are the two most important, vitamin B6 and calcium and magnesium citrate at meal times. Other useful supplements will include omega-3 fatty acids, but these should already be a daily staple in your child's program. Taurine, which is an amino acid-like compound, great supplement. The mineral selenium, then N-acetylglucosamine, chondroitin sulfate, vitamin E, and arginine. Occasionally, these last few may be recommended by a practitioner if they deem it. If this is in cases where the oxalate burden is particularly heavy and you want all the help you can get, basically, right? So that was a little overview of what oxalates are, why they can be a problem for autistic children. We went over a few of the most the highest oxalate containing foods. I gave you a brief overview of the low oxalate diet and some supplements that you can also use to add to the protocol in case you do the organic acids test and you do indeed see that elevated oxalates are an issue for your child. So I hope that you found this episode helpful, and I hope to see you on the next one.